I know when some people say they're happy to be here, they don't really mean it.
Using Treasury's own analysis, isn't it accurate that those earning under $400,000 would see their tax burden increase? Corporations are nothing but a sheet of paper. Their management, their employees, and their customers.
I mean, it was very disingenuous. A sleight of hand. Are there any countries in the world that tax unrealized capital gains?
Senator, if those unrealized gains are good enough to take to a bank to get hundreds of millions
I'm sorry,
of dollars,
I asked a different question, and I get to ask the questions.
So your budget increases spending by 66%. That's a lot.
Do you know what a dollar that you held at the start of the Biden administration is worth today?
I'm sure you'll let me know, Senator.
And again, that damage is done. Again, what sparked
most economists
sparked 40-year high inflation?
Only in Washington, D.C. do you make the claims that increasing the cumulative deficits by $16 trillion is a decrease.
Thank you, Ms. Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's bipartisanship.
So let me first say good morning to our committee members present and offer a special welcome to our witness, Shalanda Young, Director of Office of Management and Budget.
I know when some people say they're happy to be here, they don't really mean it, but I spent the majority of my adult career in this institution of Congress, so even though it might be a rough morning for me, I'm happy to be here. And thank you for the chance to get to talk about the President's fourth budget, as you heard Ranking Member Grassley say. And from day one, this administration, President Biden, has tackled challenges head-on while delivering long-lasting results for the American people. Over the past 3 years, he has overseen a strong economic recovery, amassed one of the most successful legislative records in generations, grown the economy from the middle out and the bottom up, and delivered important progress for the American people.
So, Director Young, the question is the expansion of eligible uses to allow LIWOP services factored into the $4.1 billion funding level proposed for LIHEAP? Was this budgeted to ensure that HHS can provide both LIHEAP and LIWOP assistance without eating into the LIHEAP program? So can you speak to that and the importance of enacting an appropriations bill that reflects this goal?
One, I helped get that program started in the appropriations bill. It saved a lot of families from water cutoffs in the middle of a pandemic. How terrible that would have been had we not done something. And we absolutely support the set-aside 2.7% and believe that would allow the LIWOP program to continue without eating into the LIHEAP program, which is also incredibly important.
Using Treasury's own analysis, isn't it accurate that those earning under $400,000 would see their tax burden increase at the very least by hundreds of billions of dollars just under the corporate tax proposal alone?
Senator Grassley, I'm happy to look at that analysis, but we took a lot of time working with Treasury to make sure none of our proposals impacted those making under $400,000. If the assumption is corporations will pass on any tax increases the President's asked for hardworking Americans, that is something we should all be concerned about. But all of his proposals are focused on those people that make over $400,000, and frankly, most of the tax proposals will hit those in the top 1% and 2% earners in this country.
Well, this estimate is by Treasury, and you said you work with Treasury, but then they're giving you conflicting views compared to what I quoted. We have also data from the Joint Committee on Taxation suggesting taxpayers under $400,000 would shoulder more than half of President Biden's corporate tax hike. And I think you keep forgetting that corporations are nothing but a sheet of paper. Their management, their employees, and their customers. And everything that corporations pay is passed on to somebody else. So you got to get over this, that tax increases on corporations affect workers by 27%, I think is what, 37% is what your own Treasury Department said.
The sleight of hand, I mean, the President said the other night that these wealthy, I think, billionaires he was describing, pay only 8% in tax. Well, what he didn't say was he wasn't talking about an income tax. I mean, it was very disingenuous. A sleight of hand, again, Academy Awards worthy. He's not talking about the income tax they pay. He knows the income tax that those people pay is a very high rate, as it should be. He's talking about putting in place a tax on the increase in value of their assets, so-called unrealized capital gains. I don't know of any country in the world that does that. Do you?
If I can talk about this in a way, if those unrealized...
Are there any countries in the world that tax unrealized capital gains?
Senator, if those unrealized gains are good enough to take to a bank to get hundreds of millions
I'm sorry,
of dollars or
I asked
billions
a different question,
they
and I get
should
to
be
ask the
taxed like
questions
income.
that I want, and I hope to get a response from you. I don't believe there's any country in the world that taxes assets or unrealized capital gains. I believe France tried it for a while and found it was a disaster and gave it up. But the president's proposing doing it and telling the American people they're only paying 8%. They're not paying 8% on their income. That's disingenuous. And by the way, I think it's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. Would devastate our economy.
In fact, it's just wonderful bipartisan effort around behavioral health, really funding and supporting health care above the neck, the same as health care below the neck. And we have made dramatic steps forward across the country right now to fund comprehensive certified community behavioral health clinics, strongly supported by communities and law enforcement, and again, very bipartisan. So in addition to increasing the investments in CCBHCs in the president's budget, you have several other proposals to strengthen and improve access to behavioral health. I wonder if you might speak for a moment about this, because this too, out in the real world, certainly across Michigan, I know across the country, these are very, very important issues.
Thank you for all the points you made. I could not have made them better. Look, president's budgets are to show a vision. Most budgets are not picked up lock, stock, and pass. But the idea is presidents should put forward how they believe the country should move forward. This president believes we have to keep investing in the American people, grow the economy for the middle class, give working families a shot in this country, and we can do that through a fair tax code. But that also means we get to do stuff like behavioral health, not only not adding to the deficit, but having $3 trillion in the savings in the deficit. And we're proud of the behavioral health budget, $20.8 billion in discretionary and mandatory resources across health and human services, $2.2 billion over 2023 spending. We enable more Americans with private insurance, Medicare, and Medicaid to access mental health and substance use disorder care. The 988 crisis line, thank you all for helping get that started. We need more resources to make that more robust. I don't think anyone here thinks we need to do less for suicide prevention in this country for civilians and our veterans. So this budget makes those commitments to the American people, and we do so in a fiscally responsible manner.
So first, since 2019, the population is up 2%. So your budget increases spending by 66%. That's a lot. The American public says, okay, so what do we get for that? 66% increase when population's up 2%. If you look at the numbers, your spending per American, or that's not yours, it's President Biden's, but spending is $21,695. The average American income is only $59,430. That's you're expecting the American taxpayer to spend 36% of their income, 36% to pay for this budget. The increase per person in spending for every new person is $434,000. So if you just look at what's happened as a result of the deficits, as a result of the spending, look at what's happened to interest expense. When in 2022, interest was you projected 305, but projected was ultimately ended up being 476 billion. So your projection right now is 965, and so far the projections out of the president's budget has been dramatically off every year. It's been dramatically low every year. Even with that, let's say it's right. This year, interest expense will be in excess of Medicare and defense. So, I mean, when anybody says they care about Medicare or Social Security, when you see a budget that just doesn't even come close to balancing, it doesn't make any sense. There's no money, there's not a dime in here to improve the Social Security Trust Fund. There's not one penny. So then you go look and say, okay, so this is Biden's 4th year, so let's see if it's working. So the revenues are not up this last year, they're down. So federal revenues are down 9%, so that's not working. So I cut taxes 100 times, my revenues went up. Inflation, so if you think about, both of us grew up in families didn't have a lot of money. So think about what's impacting families like ours. Groceries are up 21% in 3 years. Gas is up 40%. Shelter's up 20%. Car payments are up 26%. If you wanted to try buy a house the day Biden took office, the cost now is just skyrocketed with what's happened to interest expense. Median household income has gone from $77,800 to $74,755. It's down 5%. So it's not, so you look at it, people, inflation's up, their wages are down. You're projecting a corporate tax rate, or not you, President Biden's projecting a corporate tax rate of 28%. I cut taxes when I was governor because I wanted every company to come to Florida. What we're telling people is, don't come to America. You should go to, well, Communist China has lower corporate tax rates. If our tax rates are higher, we're in a global economy, what's a company going to do? They're going to go where the taxes are lower, and they should, whether we like it or not. Now, let's look at jobs. In the last 4 months, we've lost 1.78 million full-time jobs. We've only added part-time jobs. We've added 909,000 part-time jobs. Just look at the employment numbers that just came out. Immigrants, legal and illegal, in the month of February added 1 million jobs. People born in America lost 500,000 jobs. Wow. When I go back to Florida, people don't think this economy is headed in the right direction. Then you look at debt. Debt to GDP. Since Joe Biden took office, the debt has grown faster than GDP. And if you look at these proposed budgets, the debt is going to continue to grow faster than GDP. How is this ever sustainable? You can't do that. You can't do it in business. You can't do it personally. You can't do it as a country. So I know you're working for somebody that has a totally different vision of the country than I do. But this, if you look at the numbers, the proposal that's been made by Joe Biden has not worked for 3 solid years. And what I'd hope is at some point that it would change. But thank you for your hard work.
Could you just talk about why it's important that we have a fair tax system that doesn't include carve-outs for special interests, and how that also helps not only provide important investments for working families, but also contributes to reducing the deficit?
Look at our Medicare proposal, Senator. By asking the wealthiest in this country to pay 1.2% more, by closing loopholes for people who have found ways not to pay Medicare taxes, we can save the Medicare program indefinitely. That is a small example. If you extrapolate to lots of different policies here of what we can do. We can do more for middle class and working families. 1.2% for Medicare. You know, this isn't, you heard the president say, he's not trying to keep rich people from being rich and maybe having 2 boats instead of 3 by helping all Americans.
Ms. Young, do you know what a dollar that you held at the start of the Biden administration is worth today?
I'm sure you'll let me know, Senator.
Well, it is a number you should know. It's worth 85 cents. That is driving an awful lot of the numbers on your budget here. It's causing an awful lot of pain for the American public. I want to kind of pick up where Senator Scott left off without really asking questions. But you take a look at what we were spending prior to the pandemic, about $4.4 trillion. I personally think in 2020 we spent too much. You know, we started talking about the CARES Act. It was about $750 billion. Within a few weeks, that was up to $2.2 trillion. It wasn't money spent very efficiently. But I think we had to do something fast. We had to do something massive so that markets wouldn't collapse. But after 2020, we had, because we spent another $2 trillion in 2020, we had so much money sloshing around the economy. At most, I think we were down 25 million jobs for a few months. Within a few months, we were up to about 8 million job losses. But come January 2021, again, so much money sloshing around, there's so much pent-up demand, those jobs are going to be coming back relatively soon. What do you think sparked the 40-year high inflation?
Senator, we can also talk about inflation that has come down by 2/3.
No,
And
again, that damage
and I
is
think
done.
most peop- and I think
Again, what sparked
most economists will-
40-year high inflation?
Most economists agree that coming out of a global pandemic, which is why we saw inflation across every major economy in this country, it was the supply chain issues, economies turning back on coming out of a once-in-a-generation pandemic, which is why you saw inflation across the globe increase.
I mean, you don't think that too many dollars chasing too few goods is the primary cause of inflation? And when you spend $2 trillion one year over the next, and then you don't readjust the baseline, I mean, how can you justify spending $4.4 trillion? And as Senator Scott was saying, population grew less than 2% over this time frame. So we go from $4.4 trillion to $6.5. 2021, when President Biden comes into office, we spent $6.8. And then 6.3. We haven't reset to the 2019 baseline. How are we ever going to recover from this?
Senator, we put forth a proposal, a way to continue to invest in the American people. If we think we have adequate child care and paid leave in this country, I welcome us to talk to hardworking Americans. We can do that by asking the top 1% and 2% to add more into the system. That way, we can not only pay for our investments, but we can bring down the deficit by over $3 trillion. We can't just talk about spending as if it only hits those programs that hit working families in this country.
I think it's a fantasy. If you make the rich pay their fair share, and by the way, the top 1% garner about 20% of the income, pay about 40% of the income tax. I mean, at some point in time, you have to say, well, that's probably a pretty fair share. Okay?
Well, if you add sales
Double
tax
an income
and local
tax,
tax,
what
they pay about
take in
25%.
income. But you know, I remember when a couple $100 billion was like real money. You know, the political process would be all upset if you're running a couple $100 billion a year deficit. Your plan to get us out of this, you're running deficits of 1.8, 1.5, 1.5, 1.5, 1.5, 1.6, it never comes down. You know, you're basically locking in at least $1.5 trillion deficits for the next 10 years. That's what you're budgeting. I mean, clearly, this is unsustainable. You don't worry about, once again, sparking massive inflation that further devalues the dollar from $1 to 85. What is going to go down to 70 to 60?
Senator, absolutely. That is why we put forth a plan that would actually bring deficits down by $3 trillion. We care about our fiscal path. This president has shown how you can still invest in the American people and achieve deficit reduction. And by the way, he worked with Republicans to sign a Fiscal Responsibility Act that would save $1 trillion on our deficit.
So you're proud of a 10-year budget that never reduces the deficit, never brings it down below basically $1.5 trillion?
Senator,
you're proud of that work?
Of course I'm proud of a budget that reduces deficits by over $3 trillion, that continues its investments in the American people. And by the way, most economists will tell you the way to look at our affordability of debt is to look at debt and deficit as a percentage of GDP. As a percentage of GDP, deficits are below 4.5%.
I don't think average Americans take a look at least $1.5 trillion deficits as far as the eye can see and think this administration is bringing down the deficit. I mean, that's just fantasy talk. Thank you.
Can you tell us about some of the challenging trade-offs that you've had to make in putting this budget together to meet budget caps?
Look, we felt it was important. When the president makes a deal, he keeps a deal, to stick by the Fiscal Responsibility Act. But I want you to know the president, the administration, fully believe in the AUKUS partnership with Australia. We fund about the equivalent of 1.3 submarines a year. We need that number to go to something like 2.3. So it is not just funding the submarines. We have got to invest in our submarine industrial base.
I want to quote something that you said and you've written as well, Director Young. The president's budget reduces the deficit by $3 trillion over the next 10 years. I think that's deceitful. I think it's disingenuous. You've repeated here multiple times. You decrease it from what to what? You decrease it from 19 to $16 trillion. Only in Washington, D.C. do you make the claims that increasing the cumulative deficits by $16 trillion is a decrease. At the end of the day, you're adding $16 trillion that my grandchildren will be paying interest on. I think it's disingenuous, and I think the American public gets that. My first question, Director Young, how much money is the federal government going to spend this year?
Senator, the budget, as many slides have shown, is about $7 trillion.
Okay, how much do you think? So we're going to spend in the current fiscal year 2024, we're going to spend about $7 trillion and then $7 trillion in the next fiscal year. Is that correct?
Well, Senator, we haven't put out a budget for the next fiscal year, but if you're talking about baselines, if nothing changes, calendar year 24 outlays will be about $7 trillion. This budget year, about $7.3 trillion.
Okay, thank you. I would just point out that from over the last 5 years that government spending has went up over 50% with no end in sight. Next, I want to talk about budget deficits for a second. $2.8 trillion, we can blame that all on COVID if you want to. Make sure it's the same graph I'm looking at. But we continue with these budget deficits of, approaching $2 trillion and perhaps more. I don't think anyone can argue that that's the future. And then we look at our national debt, of course, that we're going to add another $2 trillion to our national debt. That's at the end of the day. Budgets be damned. I want to turn and ask a couple questions about Ukraine funding. Yesterday, Politico reported that the Department of Defense has sent $10 billion worth of weapons to Ukraine that it does not have the money to replace. Is that reporting accurate?
Senator, I think no one was officially quoted from the administration in the article. I've read the article. So I'm not going to comment on unauthorized or people who speak on background. What I will say is if our Ukraine supplemental passed
I understand
the House,
that. Is the $10 billion funding accurate?
Senator, if we had the Ukraine funding,
I understand that. That's not my question. I wish you would just answer my questions and not divert to different
Senator, you're
things.
asking me a question based on unnamed sources.
So is the
in an
$10 billion
article.
figure accurate?
We are very disappointed.
That really, in reality, we didn't just send $113 billion. By the time there's a big difference between what these weapons we send cost versus the value of them today.
That's right.
So in reality, this is not a question. In a reality, we've really sent them $121 billion, and you said nothing to dispute that as being accurate. I want to go on. Here is a question for you. Does the administration have the ability to provide any additional aid to Ukraine in the absence of congressional action, yes or no?
So, Senator, we have to do the supplemental.
I understand. I understand that's your opinion. We don't have to do anything. That's your opinion. Will you just try to answer my question? Does the administration have the ability to provide any additional aid to Ukraine in the absence of congressional action? That's a yes or no question.
Senator, if we have additional replenishment funds.
I understand that. Will you so you're not going to answer my question?
No, Senator, I'm trying to. If we have additional replenishment funds, if materials come in cheaper than we thought, that will give us the room to maybe do another drawdown package. We're looking at that. The Department of Defense goes in and buys equipment. If some comes in cheaper and we have
Let me ask you the question in a different way. Will this administration provide Ukraine any additional aid in any form until Congress passes the supplemental?
Senator, if we believe we can do that, to your first question, if we believe we could do that without affecting U.S. readiness in a detrimental way, we absolutely will. It is the President's commitment that we will not let Vladimir Putin march through Ukraine.
But we've been told over and over by this administration that we need to spend another $10 or $20 billion to replenish what we've given to Ukraine. So we didn't properly account for what we've already sent them. I still think we're $10 or $20 billion short of what we appropriated.
Senator, we're worried about defense readiness past the supplemental.
Thanks, Senator Marshall.
So we have put laws in place that essentially create the very dynasty wealth that the founders warned us against as creating a very unequal society. Is that not right?
Senator, we share your concerns, which is why this president speaks a lot about closing the gap, the wealth gap in this country. That is why we do something about in-kind real estate transactions. That is why we do a 25% billionaire tax. Most Americans have no idea of all these ways to get around paying taxes. Most people
Absolutely.
work, they get a paycheck, and they get taxed.
How would the Medicare tax proposals in the Biden budget assure this program's solvency in a fair and equitable manner?
I talked about this a little earlier, and thank you for your work on this proposal, Senator. It not only helps the Medicare program stay around indefinitely if we adopt. The prescription drug piece would ensure that seniors pay less and the government pay less, and it helps with our deficit reduction. The president's Medicare proposal would ask those at the top 1% and 2% to pay 1.2% more into Medicare. It also closed loopholes that the wealthy have found not to pay Medicare tax in this country. It would expand our prescription drugs from the amount that are in law now due to the Inflation Reduction Act to bring in more drugs. That saves costs for the American people. And frankly, these are common sense things. If we want to do something about Medicare solvency indefinitely, these are common sense ways to go about it, and the president believes in them, and this is our second time proposing these changes.
Director Young, why is it important to fund evidence-based and public health-focused harm reduction, prevention, treatment for substance and polysubstance use disorder for all Americans?
Senator, there's a reason this is prioritizing the president's budget. We have seen American family after American family, their story about substance use disorder and what it has done and the generational harm it can cause. It's absolutely critical, just like any other health care disorder, that we have the resources needed. We have to make sure that insurance companies cover mental health and substance use disorder like any other ailment that might befall someone in a physical nature. So we take this seriously. I've been heartened by the bipartisan interest in doing something about this. It's going to take both parties coming together. One more thing we haven't talked about a lot today is also stopping the flow of some of these dangerous drugs that have come across our border. And part of the president's supplemental request that remains stuck is putting equipment into our land ports of entry to make sure we can stop fentanyl crossing our borders.
Isn't there a point where, I think it's called the modern monetary theory, where deficits and cumulative debt just don't make any difference anymore? Do you believe that?
Senator, I believe we need to make sure debt and deficits as a percentage of GDP don't make our debt unsustainable. So no, I do think there are measures we have to be very careful about. We need to make sure real net interest stays well below, as a share of GDP, 2%. Our deficits in the long run are about 4.5% of GDP. Most economists believe those levels make our debt manageable. So we agree on the need to manage our fiscal house. But we think nominal numbers tell one story. Yeah. The more complex story is looking at a lot of these things as a share of GDP.
I think the only other country that's taken that more to the limit would be Japan, and they're a country that's got a lot of issues with their economy in terms of how it's growing. A lot of what you want to do through government, I don't think is going to be sustainable when we don't put more discipline into the configuration. So I think a lot of the things you talked about are in jeopardy because we just cannot, over time, when the facts and figures say we've never generated more than 17.5% to 18% of our GDP in federal revenues, having a federal government now that's taking government to up to 25% higher than what it was pre-COVID, and we're not involved in a war. Think about that. I think we need to pay more attention to it, or else I think the country in the long run is going to be going through some really tough times living beyond our means. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Senator Bronny. You're no longer the last senator.
Senator Graham, you're recognized.
Thank you. Welcome, Ms. Young.
Thank you.
I'm not going to ask you any questions. So I'm just going to make a statement here about the budget. You know, we got problems with the budget over here and taxes and spending. But one thing about this budget that I think is not just unique to President Biden, the defense side of this budget is not good for our country. It was a result of a deal negotiated, I think, with the former Speaker of the House and the administration approved by the Senate. And I just want the American people to understand, from my point of view, for whatever it's worth, I've never seen this many threats at once. According to the FBI director, wherever you look, you see blinking red lights. ISIS is coming back in Afghanistan. We've got a land war in Europe. Everybody's running out of ammunition. Russia's out producing the West. And you've got Israel in a fight for its life. So the needs to arm our allies is the greatest I've ever seen it. Quite frankly, literally, we're having to scramble to meet production needs. Hopefully the aid package will get out of the House, but our ability to deter bad actors is completely gone away. With no further business before the committee, the hearing is adjourned. Thank you, Ms. Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's bipartisanship.